Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the MakdisiStreet podcast. My name is Sadi Makdisi, and I'm joined by my brothers Usama and Kareem. And today we're just doing a roundup of where things stand. We're recording in early September, and the latest news as of last night was the Israeli bombing of the Mawasi's so-called safe zone, their own self-declared safe zone in central Gaza. They dropped, I think, three Mark 84 2,000-pound bombs. If anybody doesn't know what a 2,000-pound bomb does, you should look at some of the video footage or just still photo footage coming out of Mawasi. 2,000-pound bombs are what they sound like they are. They create enormous damage. The, the craters that they leave are uh, probably 30, 40 feet deep, maybe 400 feet in diameter. I mean, they're enormous blasts. And these bombs were dropped on people on a packed refugee tent city. People, whole families living in tents. Three of these bombs were dropped on them, and dozens and dozens of people were killed. All the bodies coming out are mostly women and children, as usual. Not that killing civilian men is any more acceptable, mind you, but and there we are, and it's like this has been going on now almost for a year. So I don't know, what is there to say. I mean, at this point, what do you guys think of this latest catastrophe in Gaza?
Well, I think, Sadi, as you said, it's been going on for a year, and the part that's part of the genocide and part of what the I would say the Israeli American official sort of plan is to basically make people despair, make people routinize the massacre of Palestinians, civilians and children, to the point where people just shrug their shoulders and move on and pretend like there's nothing going on, there's nothing that can be done. This will continue, and that is exactly what they want. They want people to routinize the killing and the massacre of Palestinians. It's absolutely shocking and disgraceful.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, wholeheartedly. I think it's the. I mean, I just was rereading the this last thing where we're talking about the justifications that take place. That leak thing where I think the German newspaper and the Jewish Chronicle as well. I think they released these documents saying that they found on some computer somewhere in Gaza about Yahya Sinwar, kind of some master plan that he wanted to kidnap people and kill people and do this kind of thing and this then gets circulated across much of the Western media as truth, and then the Jerusalem Post and other Israeli media eventually come out and say this is all forged. It's not true. It's obviously doesn't make sense that somebody like Sinwar would just sit there on the computer, plan out a document, leave it on this computer. The computer would somehow survive the bombardment. Somehow, miraculously, some Israeli would go in there and find it, and then give it to some German, newspaper to publish these secret documents that are very self-incriminating. Now, we've seen this so often across the years and the decades, both by the U.S. and by the Israelis. But of course, it's very simple. They take it, they release it, it gets out there, it ends up in politicians and congressmen's speeches and in various media outlets, and then somewhere down the line it gets denied, and but that gets lost along.
But by then the damage has been done already, right?
The damage is done, and the idea that Hamas is to blame for no ceasefire and that they're the ones putting conditions, and the Israelis are okay with it, but Sinwar and these guys are the rejectionists. This is this is just as incredibly insidious, just incredibly dangerous, and destructive, and helps to justify the killings that's taking place.
But can I just jump in here, Karim and Sadi, and just ask? I said earlier that this is part of I'd say the routinization of Palestinian death and the massacre of Palestinian children and the killing and starvation of innocent civilians and just the mass slaughter that we're seeing in the genocide in Gaza it's all designed to sort of make us sort of give up at some point and just say, okay, there's nothing we can do, and we just carry on kind of thing, which of course is what nobody should do, is just routinize the death and the killing of children and of civilians. But the question I have is, Sadi, your sort of strategic sort of military kind of guru on this podcast kind of thing.
No,
What is
somewhat.
like
That's not exactly true.
Okay, fair enough. But you know what I mean. What do you think in terms of like strategically? What is the plan exactly? How do you explain the U.S. policy and the plan in terms of all these and Kenny, you too, I guess, all these negotiations, these so-called negotiations are these completely fake cover for Israeli genocide, or is it that the Americans do want a ceasefire of some sort, but they have no way of putting pressure on their alleged client state, Israel, because Biden is AWOL, and because the Democrats are, like the Republican Party, are sort of, completely Zionist at the decision making levels. What is it? How do you explain this? How do you explain this complete sort of absurd sort of comedy, the charade of negotiations on the one hand, so-called negotiations, and on the other hand, the endless slaughter of Palestinians?
Well, I mean, like the thing about the negotiations, people have said this. I can't remember who. I know somebody else has said this, not just us. But the interesting thing about these so-called ceasefire negotiations is they're now playing a role analogous to the Oslo peace process. Where there's a process of talking, alleged talking that goes on, that kind of goes on in the background, while in the meantime what the Israelis call facts on the ground continued to be imposed. In the case of the Oslo peace process, those facts on the ground were principally the expropriation of Palestinian land, the demolition of Palestinian homes, and the construction of Jewish settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. In this case, these supposed talks go on and on and on and on, in fits and starts, but in fact the bombing continues, relentlessly, as we're saying. So why is it that the US can't stop? I mean, there's two ways of explaining it. This goes back to something we've talked about on this podcast, for months now. The one possibility is that the US doesn't want to stop the Israelis, because of course we all know it can. If it wanted to, it can just say, no, that's it, enough is enough, no more bombs. The three Mark 84 2,000-pound bombs that the Israelis dropped on the Moesi yesterday are American made. They're paid for by our tax dollars, shipped by our aircraft, and dropped by Israeli fighter jets also made in the USA, F-35s or F-16s.
Meanwhile, our public education, sorry to say, meanwhile, our public education, our roads, our infrastructure is all falling apart
Completely
in
falling
this
apart.
country.
So one
Yeah.
so one possibility is the US doesn't want this, doesn't care, and is invested in this, and that's the narrative that sees the Israelis as America's tool. And the other narrative is the flip side of that, which is to say that the US American foreign policy is, to some extent, to a large extent, dictated by the Zionist lobby in Washington. And so therefore White House policy is, in fact, it's an arm of Tel Aviv, not the other way around, which to me seems more. I mean, again, because one of the other stories that's circulating now is the Israeli murder of an American activist in the West Bank, which I know we're going to get to in a few minutes. Not the first, but by no means the first American citizen that the Israelis have killed. They killed Shireen Abu Akleh several years ago. They killed Rachel Corrie almost 20 years ago now, I think, in Gaza. They've, as we all know, they attacked the USS Liberty in 1967 and killed 34 U.S. Navy crewmen. And the U.S. has never done anything about any of these things. Biden is very big, like other U.S. presidents, in saying, "If you hurt an American, we're going to come get you." And of course, it never happens when the Israelis kill Americans, almost as a matter of routine. So, to me, it seems pretty clear. It's the Israelis activating their assets in Washington, and then the assets go to work. By the way, another story that's making the rounds, you may have seen this, is the Israelis have released orders to the congressman that they controlled in Washington, saying, now your job now is to go after South Africa to get it to put pressure on South Africa to withdraw its case in the International Court of Justice. I mean, this, again, as a student of empire, it's extraordinary to me to see the so-called client state dictating to the great power what should be done. This is like in the 18th century, if some Irish, petty lord in Ireland was dictating to London what should or shouldn't be done in terms of British imperial policy, or the Maharaja of somewhere in India is telling the British in London, this is what your imperial policy is going to be. It's absurd in the context of imperial history, but that seems to me, at least, based on the evidence we have. Well, the other possibility is, yes, this is the Americans are fully invested in what's happening, and they're perfectly happy for this massacre to go on, to continue. Although it's not clear to me how it serves American interests. I don't think it does. In fact, I would say it's detrimental to American interests. I don't know, but what do you guys think? Kareem, you often take up the other side of the story here.
I don't take up the other side. I just think that two stories can coexist at the same time. I think the kind of larger American strategic interest gets laid down, and that's the question at the regional level. So we saw when the Israelis attacked Iran and Lebanon and Beirut, we've seen that after all the tension, the Iranians still haven't responded. We know the Americans have been negotiating behind the scenes. God knows what they're giving them. God knows what the deal might or might not be, and maybe the Iranians will still respond. We don't know, but that whole situation seems to have calmed down a little bit. Even the response from Lebanon, Hezbollah did this kind of dramatic attack, but then there was no Israeli acknowledgement or no Israeli response, and that sort of died down as well. And the atmosphere in Lebanon got, at least outside of South Lebanon, got, sort of got better. Tourists started to come back again. There was slightly more optimism, if one can talk about that in relative terms. So at this regional level, we still see the Israelis were and trying to provoke a regional war, and they've not been able to do that even now. So at that level, I think there is a clear American intervention to say, no, you cannot do this. And even if that means negotiating with Iran to give them concessions on something else, we don't know. I mean, eventually we'll figure it out, but clearly something's going on at that level. On the question of within Palestine itself, and specifically, and I would even separate Gaza from the West Bank. I think in Gaza in particular, the Americans have clearly told them, we don't care. We're not interested. We'd like a ceasefire at this point. Enough is enough, and we'd like a ceasefire. There's elections going on. We need Michigan and Pennsylvania and these kinds of marginal places. So please calm down. But we're not going to exert the effort. Both said it because what you said, because of AIPAC and the lobby. It's just not worth their time to fight that for securing a ceasefire. And on the other hand, they don't think their big strategic interests are particularly hurt in the context of Gaza itself. Nobody's putting pressure on them. Saudi Arabia is not putting pressure. Egypt is not putting pressure. None of these countries really, in effect, are putting any kind of pressure. So it doesn't really matter. The fact that they want to cease fire, ideally, but are not willing to fight for it in an election year against Netanyahu, who's playing them quite well in that regard. The concession,
yeah, but that's sorry, but
I think
there's
a concession. I think the concession to Netanyahu is to say, go ahead, do what you want in Gaza. We're not going to push you too much, but on the question of Iran and the regional thing, you have to calm down. I think that's
but the pressure, Kareem, the pressure that's there is domestic. Is strictly, if there is insofar as there is pressure in the U.S. or on the U.S., it's that domestic electoral pressure, right? Because like we saw, I think you were circulating those poll numbers the other day that showed, I can't remember the exact percentages, but very, very solid majorities of people in swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and other places want there to be a ceasefire. So in that sense, it is in the Democratic Party's interest for there to be a ceasefire, not because they care about human life, but for their own electoral purposes, right? So that pressure does exist.
But then suddenly they get outflanked by sort of mega donors and and AIPAC and all these other sort of organizations that the Democratic elite, like the Republican elite in the Democratic Party and Republican Party, are completely beholden to. I mean, in the end, you're sort of weighing different sets of interests, right? I think that's what Karim is trying to say. You're trying to wait. But I think, Karim and Sadi, I think also, I mean, I've been struck as a historian, I've been struck by, if ever, our listeners and our viewers want to think about how it is and how could it be possible that people could oversee such extraordinary genocide and evil and depravity as we see in Gaza, in terms of the mass slaughter, the routinization of the killing of children, the starvation, the bombing of refugee camps, so-called humanitarian zones, the everyday pictures of children that you see on every single sort of social media outlet, the extraordinary death and killing and depravity that we see, and the routinization of that, not just in terms of making us feel, oh, it's okay, it's nothing we can do about it, but also the sheer, as Karim was saying, the sheer lack of interest. And then you explain how it was that the same
lack of interest, you mean in the mainstream media or what?
In the mainstream media and among the people who support and in the government circles, like the Kirby and these people, do they care about Palestinian death? I doubt it. And then you think about, so taking it back, sort of trying to step this back more historically, thinking about genocides of Native Americans, of indigenous populations, the way people in the 19th century, Seti, and the early 20th century, the way people just accepted, especially in colonizing societies, accepted mass death of natives. That's something that you just did, and nobody batted an eyelid, and you justified it, and that's what
Yeah,
happened.
but Osama,
So I keep thinking,
but as you just said, the difference between those 18th century, 18th or 19th century, or even by the way, even early 20th century genocides, is that they weren't beamed into the palm of your hand. That's the big difference, right?
indeed, no, they weren't beamed into the palm of our hands. But the point is, nevertheless, they knew about it back in the 19th century, and they certainly justified it. They justified the Trail of Tears. They justified the obliteration of people in what is Namibia today. Yeah, they've done these in Algeria and so on and so forth. There've been
Australia,
massacres,
Tasmania.
Australia, exactly. So there've been massacres of people and genocides committed. It's not that it's true they weren't live streamed, but they were certainly supported and endorsed and embraced. Right? I think that's I think where that's the larger, I think, historical view that we're talking about. There's something else that's going on. So to go back to what Karim was saying about the sort of Kirby and these people, I think there is a part of American policy, especially when it comes to Palestine. And I think, and this is also reflected in the Arab state elites that are completely complicit in this. There is a policy aspect which basically says, let's be done with the Palestinians once and for all. Right? Okay, this is what I think. I see this as happening. Let's be done. This is, I think, the thinking. Let's be done with them. Let's create facts on the ground. Let the Israelis expel them, massacre them, murder them, push them into Egypt, whatever it is, ethnically cleanse them. Let's be done once and for all so we can finally be rid and done with this problem that's been a thorn in our sides.
No,
That's
I
what I think.
disagree.
That's how I. You think so? You disagree?
Yeah. No, I think I mean I think you're taking a little bit of an extreme I think take on this. I think the idea is for if you're talking about the so-called Arab elite or you're talking about the Arab leaders, basically
No. I'm talking
authoritarian.
about the American policymakers like Kirby and the guy and the people who are. I think just they want to they want to wash their hands up. Like, let's be done with these people.
What they want is what they thought they were going to get before October 7th, which is a larger regional deal, normalization between the Israelis and the Saudis, which would then set the path for everybody else along the line, at least in the non-axis of resistance line. That you have this normalization, you have the PA, which kind of morphs into some, whatever, some kind of Bantustan, whatever it is, and whatever. They would dress it up. They would give them something to cling on to some kind of formal kind of recognition in some very warped kind of way. And that's the way that they wanted this thing to go away. So once you had the Saudi Israeli normalization plan and all that goes with it, you throw some money for reconstruction, stuff like that, to Palestinians, and their problem would go away in this sense. The whole point of October 7th, at least one of the points, was that it dispensed with that, the sense that, once again, you cannot have this regional deal without the Palestinians and Palestinian agency. Whether it's in a positive sense or negative sense, whether it's violent or non-violent, they're there and they have to be dealt with on their own terms. This is what comes out of this, and I don't think anybody particularly cares about massacring Palestinians or not. Some of the Israelis do,
No.
but in
I'm
general,
not
they,
saying. I'm
they,
not
they
saying.
want the problem to go away politically rather than
That's
having to kill
that's what I
everybody.
mean. That's what I mean. I mean politically. Get rid of the Palestinians politically.
So a
As in, if
ceasefire
you can just
helps.
ethnically, if you a ceasefire helps, but ethnically cleansing also helps. That was what they were pushing initially, right? Isn't that what you said Blinken was pushing for initially? Getting them
Blinken
all
is
to
an idiot.
Egypt.
I don't think Blinken was representing something much larger than himself. He went to Tel Aviv and he said, "I'm there as a Jewish person first." So I don't know what Blinken was representing when he went there, and he tried to get Egypt to open its doors to take in people there. I don't think he had. I don't think this guy's a genius. I don't think he had a huge plan.
But it's not just Blinken. It's also McGurk. It's also the guy at Rice University, whatever his name is, the guy who heads the Baker Institute. I can't remember his name.
These are
He's another one of these
ideas.
guys who,
These are fantasies. They had.
yeah, fantasies. But that's my point. My point is the fantasy, as I've been saying, the fantasy is to be done with the Palestinians. I don't mean to be clear. It's not that I'm saying that American policymakers want all Palestinians slaughtered. No, ideally they'd rather have them disappear from view. That's what they like. Oslo, put them in a box, forget about them, freeze them out, be done with them once and for all. And if it means giving the Israeli, because that's to them is what, as you said, the more important thing for the American policymakers is the Saudi-Israeli deal, right? Isn't that getting what you're saying? And a regional sort of Pax Americana based on this idea of Gulf states and Israel and Egypt.
Yeah, is that a
Isn't that
Pax?
what you were
Is
saying?
that Sama? But is that a Pax Americana or a Pax Israeliana? I mean, I guess that we come back
Well,
to that
whatever,
question.
yeah, and we can come back to that. But the point is that, but they really want the Palestinians disappeared as a political problem, and insofar as they want that disappeared, they're perfectly happy, or they're willing, maybe that's a better way of putting it, to tolerate Palestinian mass death because it's simply, as Karim was saying, they're not going to spend the capital to sort of stop the Israelis. Is that fair to say? Would you say
I think
what it's about?
I think there's a separation between in the actual and policy terms between how they're dealing with Gaza now and how they're dealing with the West Bank. It's not the
How
same.
so? How so?
There are differences. So they want to disappear the Palestinians and Palestine as a political problem. That I think we agree on 100%. They tried that through Oslo. The Israelis didn't want that. They purposely stopped it. They're trying this through the Trump deal and the kind of regional normalization deals. The Israelis have not allowed that to happen, and now through what happened on October 7th onwards, the Palestinians have not let that happen. So the ceasefire is another, it could be fantasy, but another mechanism as far as this business of the post-war, the day after scenarios, which is to say, let's pretend we can bring back Mahmoud Abbas back from the dead. He goes into Gaza, or some. Remember that at one point they even a few months ago tried some kind of tribal arrangement somewhere in Gaza. So they come up with these fantasies of theirs, tribal arrangements, or Palestinian Authority kind of comes in, and for them they don't really care about the details. It's sweeping that because Mahmoud Abbas will say yes to whatever the Saudis and the Americans and the Israelis tell him to do. So he'll just do it. So that's for them a fantasy of hiding the Palestinian problem in political terms under the guise of a regional deal in which the Saudis normalize with the Israelis. That's the goal. So you're disappearing the political problem, not so much people per se. They don't care
But
about the
Karim,
people.
if you follow that narrative, which you just laid out, which is persuasive in various ways, we come up against the problem, which is that according to that logic, then the U.S. really should be pushing for a ceasefire because it would suit that narrative, right? Let's stop the bombing. Look, oh, Joe Biden, the great white savior, finally brought about peace in Gaza, and he restored calm, and that we're going to help the Palestinians rebuild, and blah blah blah, and the hostages go back home. And so, like, it fits the narrative perfectly, right? So we come back to this chicken or egg thing. Why aren't they then pushing for a ceasefire? But with one phone call they could make a ceasefire happen, but they're not.
They don't want to. I think Osama mentioned it. There is an election going on. APAC at a certain point for many months. If you remember, we had these discussions earlier, where APAC and the Israeli lobby and all the kind of Zionists that are operating in those spheres had lost the ball. They were losing public opinion in America. They were losing public opinion in the world. There was the ICJ case. There was the ICC case. There was the second ICJ case. So there was a clear sense that the Israelis had lost. They were losing their grip on the image. They were losing their grip on the narratives. They were losing grip even on what some politicians were doing and not doing. There were some people breaking away locally, even in Congress. There were a few more than you would expect that were beginning to voice a kind of concern. APAC has obviously redone itself, and the Israelis and the APAC, they kind of reformulated their strategy, and they've been working, one has to say, more effectively over the past several weeks and months. They've sidelined Biden now. They've taken over. They've understood. And Netanyahu, when he went, I mean, it's not a coincidence. We said this before. When Netanyahu went to America a month or whenever it was ago, he came back,
July.
and suddenly,
July.
in July, and he came back, and then he said, that's when he attacked Lebanon, he attacked Iran, and he started to really push very vocally, very obviously against the ceasefire deals. So he clearly understood. I don't think so much that the Americans were going to give him whatever he wanted, as much as he could play that. He understood the uncertainty. He understood that Biden was basically gone, and not that he cared that much. Harris was just, is pretty weak and kind of controlled through the corporate machinery that's there, and is not going to stake her whole reputation now on trying to fight against AIPAC and Netanyahu. Trump is Trump. He'll take advantage of whatever needs to be done there. So Netanyahu is taking full advantage of all of that stuff that's taking place. And so the idea is, I think that he knows that he has until at least October to do what he wants in Gaza without, with occasional pressure here and there, but without real formal kind of pressure until October. Then the Democrats might tell him, okay, we want a deal now. He may say, I don't want the Democrats, I want Trump to come in. So I think this is how this is being played. I think there is a clear understanding that it's not so much allowed, it's that they're not going to expend any kind of energy on the Democratic side to oppose the Israelis, to oppose AIPAC, when they have things that for them, they have other things that they want to deal with, that this is simply not at the top of their agenda. The thing that is higher up on the agenda is the regional war, Iran, etc., these kinds of things, and they've managed to control that. That's just looking at it a little bit from a distance. That's why I think you can link these two things together.
I agree with Karim. I agree with the analysis 100% what Karim just said. I think that's absolutely spot on. That I still think that analysis itself is predicated on what I've been talking about, which is a much longer history of obliteration of indigenous peoples and native peoples and colonized peoples. That is part and parcel of how this entire sort of scenario is playing out before our eyes. In other words, it's also predicated on the idea that non-Western life, that the darker nations, to quote Vijay Prashad, that these peoples of the third world, of the global south, are expendable. I think that's part of this I think that's part of this whole premise. I think that this
If
is
you would allow me a rejoinder on that particular point, obviously, of course, the history of Western colonialism reinforces exactly what you just said, that the
it's not just Western
expendability of
colonialism, it's genocidal, it's settler colonialism and genocidal elimination of natives. Yeah.
that history, of course, I don't disagree with, but there is very, very significant at some level. I mean, Karim is right in a way that APAC it proudly boasts that it spent $100 million so far in the electoral cycle this year, which is unprecedented foreign interference in American domestic political arrangements. Which that's a whole other story. But it's clearly done that. However, the suppression we see that APAC is engaging in, the suppression we witness on our own university campuses, reminds us it's not just that they can run roughshod over all these people and people don't care. There is a reaction. There is at some level, especially among university students, but even among Democratic voters in general, there is more than just questioning. There is significant opposition to what the Israelis are doing, and therefore to American policy allowing Israel to do what it does. It's not untrammeled. It's not like people aren't saying, whoa, hang on, wait a minute here. We know, again, from poll numbers that have been very, very consistent since October and November, 80% across the board, 80% of Americans want there to be a ceasefire now. That's been very, very consistent. So it's not like there isn't American popular opposition to what these people are doing, including their own government, right? All of the what was that, the movement in the spring, with the Democratic primaries to vote uncommitted or undecided, whatever the phrase was. Like, there is significant opposition. Yes, you're right. It is so far being put under the table, but it's not like it's going away. It's there. And I don't think we should overlook it. It's not like there is absolute uniformity and unanimity in the extermination of the Palestinians in the West. That's simply not true.
I agree. I'm not saying there's uniformity. I'm saying it's building on a legacy of an entire history of obliteration of native peoples. But you're absolutely right. We're now in the 21st century. People have educated themselves. People are more aware. There is massive mobilizations. We've seen them in demonstrations in cities around the world, in on campuses and our campuses. There's no question that there is a shift taking place, but not at the level of policy elites. Karim, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're agreeing at a certain level, but I think we can think of these as two parallel tracks that are kind of go back and forth. So the question of the domestic thing and even international opinion, but if you want to talk about the United States and domestic opinion, of course it is shifted, and that's reflected in the polls. It's reflected. I mean, I think that's fairly well known at this point, fairly well established. But that goes up and down in terms of its being able to influence the actual policy making and decisions and the way in which supposed strategic interests are being calculated. So this is separate. One is a longer term trend which will have impact going forward. One is a question of short term, over the question of weeks and months. What somebody like Netanyahu is going to feels like he can get away with in a week or two or three, the kind of revamping of the APAC strategy and tactics that they clearly changed over the past few weeks or a couple of months, that has become more effective.
Can you elaborate on what does this revamping mean to you? I mean, what have you seen? What is revamped exactly? So you can explain to our viewers and listeners what you mean.
No, I just think there was a moment, or quite a long moment, where in America and internationally there was a huge shift, a very visible and clear shift of opinion, sympathizing with the Palestinians and progressively going against Israelis. So that's not necessarily the same thing, but sympathy for the Palestinians for sure, and increasing antagonism against the Israelis and what the Israelis are doing, and therefore the politicians and others that were supporting Israel without any kind of conditions. I think APAC and those are they were being exposed, and the kind of lies and the kinds of tactics that they had were being spoken about. I can't remember, there was a couple of elections where the amount of money that was spilled into certain elections, that became clear that what they were doing, it was put online, it was discussed, mainstream press was talking about it. Talking about APAC today is not controversial anymore, to say that they're funding and paying in ways that years ago
They say it. They
they
boast
say
it.
it.
They say
Yeah,
100 million.
but years ago you couldn't talk. Even months ago you couldn't really talk about it without oh, you're being anti-Semitic, you're being. And now okay, you get attacked for being anti-Semitic, but it's there. It's like apartheid. It's like genocide. These terms are now out there, and everybody understands them. They're being hushed up, but everybody understands them. So that was the concession that was made to the shift in public opinion. On the other hand, they've had some success, and in these last couple of elections, I can't remember who you guys know them more than me, Bowman
Cory
and
Bush,
Cory Bush and these
and
guys, they
Bowman,
were
among
ousted.
others.
They
Yeah.
were so these were the most vocal. These were the more people like what's her name, Ocasio Cortez has changed her tune. So she remains against the genocide, etc. In her own sort of Bernie Sanders kind of way, but clearly she shifted her tune, because she now it's not just Gaza or Palestine related. I mean, she has other more important things as far as she's concerned. But she's clearly shifted. She's ambitious. She wants to go into the mainstream, and she wants to be in like the hardcore politics. And she knows she has to go towards the center for that, while retaining the kind of Bernie Sanders kind of constituency. She understands that, but that's a big voice, a very visible voice that has shifted and kind of gone down. The more the kind of the louder voices like Cory Bush and others, these have been taken out. And you have people like Rashida Tlaib, who can be put into a corner as well. She's Palestinian, so she can be put into this. She's a hysterical Palestinian woman kind of corner. Even though she does incredible.
They can box her. They can box her. Put her in a
They
box.
can box her in that kind of way. So they've organized in a more piecemeal, slightly more organized way, rather than kind of sitting on a perch and saying, we will just do everything. They understood that they were taking heavy losses in the public opinion, even politically. And I think I don't know how. I mean, I haven't seen documents, but I just in the way
100 million. They say it. They say it themselves.
Yeah, but it's been
I
effective.
think we can switch, and we can. This is a good point to segue into a different discussion, which is to say, how does the shift that Karim you're talking about and Sadi you're alluding to, how does this shift also reflect in the complete inability of the U.S. State Department or the U.S. government to take seriously the killing, the murder of Ayşenur Ezgi, I think, or Eygi, the American who was killed who was shot in the head in the West Bank, a young American, recent graduate from, I think, University of Washington, I think, in Seattle, murder, shot in the head yet again. I mean, this is not the first American to be killed. Shireen Abu Akleh was the journalist, the famous journalist, was killed, shot in the head as well. And of course, many others have been shot over the years, going all the way back to Rachel Corrie, and I'm sure before Rachel Corrie as well. Rachel Corrie was bulldozed actually to death. And yet now you have the State Department, the charade of the State Department, and John Kirby. Just they're unable to say anything. All they can say is that they have nothing to say except to say that we trust Israel, or we're waiting for Israel to investigate itself. How does that fit in? Because that's consistent. That's been consistent from day one. This obscene sort of American official performance of unable to ever condemn Israelis, always sort of never able to answer a single question really with any honesty or integrity, and unable to pronounce with any kind of decency what is an absolutely unacceptable, from an American perspective, the killing of American civilians. Had this person been killed by Hamas, there would have been outrage, and Biden would have said, unacceptable, outrageous, blah, blah, blah. But when the Israelis do it, terrorists, when the Israelis do it, and they do it routinely, the Israeli army does it, the American government is unable to say anything. So what do you guys think about that? How does that fit into this what Karim's calling the revamping? I don't say this. I think this is consistency. This is an absolute. This is a standard, consistent devaluation of life before our eyes.
Yeah, but in this case, it's American life, right? And again, to my mind, it goes back past Rachel Corrie to the USS Liberty. I mean, that attack spoke. I mean, it still speaks volumes in terms of the history of this relationship. What other country in the world could attack a U.S. Navy ship and kill 34 U.S. Navy crewmen and just not only just walk away scot-free, but have the U.S. itself cover up that that's what happened? It's the same thing. So here's this ex-UW student in the West Bank shot through the head by an Israeli army sniper. Though I couldn't see the people in the State Department, but I'm sure they're saying or said, we trust the Israelis to investigate terrible,
No, the words they
the
use.
usual kind of
I think the words they use are. I think the official American language is deeply disturbed. I mean,
deeply
that's
disturbed.
just deeply disturbed, as
Call upon
opposed
the
to.
Israeli army to investigate itself, and of course, the Israeli army is going to do what it's going to investigate itself and find itself innocent.
Now, it's saying Blinken said it was unprovoked and unjustified, and called for fundamental changes to the U.S. allies' conduct, meaning Israelis.
Yeah, as they've been saying for 10 months now. Too many civilians are being killed in Gaza, but here's some more bombs. Same thing.
Please bomb responsibly. Exactly. That's what the Americans keep saying to people. But in terms of but Sadi, let's just segue to this thing. Doesn't this inability? How does this inability at the level of government and officials in government to actually talk about Palestinians or Americans, for that matter, who are killed, slaughtered, assassinated? How does that sort of mirror our own institutions' inability, over the past year to actually talk about Palestinians and genocide and scholasticide? That's what I keep I keep puzzling.
Before you answer that one, Sadi, because you mentioned earlier in connection to this, to the killing of the American and this incredible kind of killing of this American woman in the West Bank. You had mentioned earlier on, Ayşenur, that you mentioned the USS Liberty attack because she's American, and this history of Israelis killing Americans and getting away with it. Can you just remind us what happened in the USS Liberty? Just because I think a lot of people don't know it, in part because it's been buried and it's not part
Which
of the
by
history
itself, yeah, exactly. Which by itself that speaks volumes that people don't know.
Yeah,
and you bring up the USS Liberty,
it's worth. So what happened?
Yeah,
Can you just
for people
quickly...
who don't know, the USS Liberty was a United States Navy intelligence gathering ship operating in international waters, actually off the coast of Gaza, but in international waters during the June 1967 war. And it was attacked over a period, first of all, surveilled by Israeli reconnaissance aircraft and then attacked over a period of about 12 hours. And the first two times the Israeli aircraft flew over the ship, the crew of the ship made sure to put the biggest American flag they had. They put up their parade flag, which is like 8 by 12 feet. It's an enormous flag to make sure the Israelis could see this is a United States ship. And they still attacked it. They attacked it with bombs. They attacked it with napalm. They strafed the decks of the ship. They torpedoed it. The ship was basically crippled when the crew began to prepare to abandon ship because it looked like it was going to sink. Israeli torpedo gunships shot up the lifeboats that the crew had put in the water. The end result was the killing of 34 U.S. Navy crewmen, the injuring of 100 and something, I don't know how many, more than 100 others, the crippling of this U.S. Navy ship, and it was completely covered up. The U.S. covered it up. The Israelis obviously don't talk about it. and it just sort of passed. It just passed out of, as you're saying, Kareem. It kind of passed out of history in a way. In fact, and the cover up went so far as the extent to which when these crewmen were given a memorial in Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, for years their memorial marker simply read, it had their names, and then it said, the tombstone said, not the tombstone, but the marker said, died Eastern Mediterranean, June 8, 1967. It didn't say crew of the USS Liberty, let alone killed in action. So this is cover up that's gone on for literally for decades. And to my mind, as somebody who looks at this history, to me, this says you could either one of two ways. Either it's Tel Aviv calling the shots, as usual, the US can't do anything to stop it, or to go back to the more kind of, more, let's say, political science, language that we could use of policy and this kind of thing, then you could say, well, the US is unwilling to pay the domestic political cost. It's not worth it to the US to pay the domestic political cost to take on this narrative. But the killing of Rachel Corrie and Shireen Abu Akli and this latest victim of this latest American victim of Israeli violence in the West Bank, it's the same. It's an extension of the same story. This There is no other country that would get away with this kind of thing. There just isn't another country that could kill American citizens with total impunity and attack a U.S. Navy ship with total impunity and just waltz off into the sunset, totally heedless and careless.
But I think the difference between the Liberty, what you're talking, the USS Liberty attack that you're talking about, Seti, and educating our listeners and viewers about, and of course they can read about this. You can now Google, and there are books about the USS Liberty attack. The difference is that you said that occurred during war and it was covered up. The difference between now what we're seeing, Karim and Seti, is that the Israelis are shooting American citizens in the head right before our eyes. It's not like it's not covered up. That's the amazing thing. It's blatant in your face. It's where the Israelis are saying we're going to be able to shoot Americans in the head, and we know perfectly well you're going to do nothing. We're not even going to cover it up. It's not that the State Department are saying no, nothing happened.
No,
They
as we
just
say,
they,
as we say, as we say in Lebanese Arabic, mitlet tutu, basically mitlet tutu.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that it doesn't really matter, or you're hitting water, you're knocking on water. It's water. Nothing's going to change. But the point is that the difference is, Sadi, the change. There is in fact change. There was a cover up in '67. There's no cover up today. It's not about covering up. This is what makes today's the depravity of today so marked for me. It's that this is all happening before our eyes. We can see what's going on. The entire world can see what's going on. And U.S. State Department spokesmen and Pentagon spokesmen and Biden and Harris and all these people, they're basically telling us to our faces, you simply don't matter and don't count. Even if you're American, you simply don't count. That's what they're saying. It's not a cover-up. It's a very clear
Yeah,
indication
that's true.
of a
That's a good point.
hierarchy of citizenship and a hierarchy of belonging, which goes back to my earlier point about the genocidal foundations of this country. I think there's some relationship. Of course, nothing goes in a straight line. I mean, there's a lot of nuance, so we can get into that. But I think it's nevertheless, to go back to the point I was making about the inability to name, and how does that relate, do you think, to the way our institutions have refused to name and talk about the scholasticide and the genocide of Gaza? How do you explain that? I mean, don't you see that as parallel? So our cultural and educational institutions mirror the political institutions and the state institutions, even though technically we're supposed to be a free society and we have freedom of speech and academic freedom and so on and so forth.
No, our universities have effectively gone to war against their own students over the past 6 months or so.
Can
And
you
that
elaborate a little bit, because you're at UCLA, and UCLA was at the center of one of the most egregious examples of repression of students, right? And then the Board of Regents of all our universities have enacted all these new things. Can you elaborate for our viewers and listeners?
Yeah, I mean, just in general, without going into superfluous detail, in general, what's happening is not just in California; it's across the United States, from the East Coast to the West Coast. There's a mobilization at the university administrative level to suppress student expressions of dissent or protest or criticism, basically. and that's that, and ultimately backed up, as we saw on campuses across the country, with the armed force of the state. Literally, more than 3,000 people were arrested, principally students, but some faculty too, were arrested across the board in the U.S. in protests. Beginning last spring, protests against American complicity in the genocide, protests against our universities, financial and administrative, in that sense, complicity in the genocide. And yeah, that narrative is completely suppressed. It's that, it's going to get worse before it gets better. But we do have actually we should maybe, as we move towards a wrap here, we should bring in, there is one little glimmering bit of good news, which is something maybe you could tell us about, because it actually concerns your campus, UC Berkeley. For once, there's a little bit of good news at an American university campus when it comes to the question of Palestine. So tell us what it is.
Well, I mean, you're referring to the launch of, or the announcement of, the Ziadi chair and the program in Palestinian and Arab Studies, which was just announced yesterday at UC Berkeley. So you're right, that is a glimmer of good news, which has to build on, of course, the fact that there, as you said, Sadi, earlier, and as Karim knows perfectly well, the other pieces of good news, which is, of course, the fact that despite, and it was very important for you to remind all of us, that despite the horror of what's going on in Gaza, there have been students and faculty and staff, in fact, across virtually every institution that I'm aware of, who have been, in fact, horrified and do stand against all of what is happening in terms of the depravity in Gaza. So this latest piece, of course, is independent in the sense that that this has been, in the works for years before October 7th, obviously, and it's all about trying to insist that Palestinians and Arabs have history, and have a rich history, and have a deep history, and an ecumenical history, and that you cannot dehumanize people once you historicize them. Like, in other words, one of the essential aspects of dehumanization is rendering people without history. We all know that this is exactly how it's always worked in the past and in the present. If you dehistoricize, you dehumanize. In other words, if you take people out of context, you make them sort of one-dimensional sort of people. And so here there's an opportunity and a moment to sort of reset. It doesn't take away. I mean, it's sort of bittersweet, because the day it was announced was the day of this horrific massacre in Mawasi. And it's very hard to. It's honestly, it's very difficult to be happy at one level, given the extraordinary genocide that we're still witnessing, and our inability to stop it. On the other hand, each of us does what we can do, and the more of us who do what we can do, there will be change in the end. That I really believe at some level. Maybe that's my naive humanist sort of approach.
No, I concur entirely. I think it's the the absence of Palestinian voices, narratives, history, literature, art, culture, and so forth on our campuses. It's not that leads, automatically to a genocide, but it's part of what helps facilitate. I mean, it exists on a continuum. In other words, right? The disappearing of Palestine, culturally, intellectually, artistically, aesthetically, historically, and so forth. That these things are coextensive with, as you're saying, the dehumanization, the physical, the material dehumanization of and dismembering of Palestinians. So that's an important thing. And so this is one small chip in that in that wall, basically, which is of dehumanization. It is extraordinary that our universities have remained so silent, not just in terms of their own student protests, which they've put down so violently, but also, as far as I know, American universities were very, very quick to condemn the attacks of October 7th and have remained essentially silent in the almost now year since the genocide took place. Silent not just in face of the genocide, but just, if nothing else, silent in the face of the destruction. You can't just say that. You need a stronger word than destruction. The extirpation of the
The
academic sector in
obliteration,
Gaza. The obliteration. Every single
of every
university is
university,
destroyed.
of every single university in Gaza,
University
and the
presidents and
destruction.
faculty and professors and students, all of that being obliterated. Not one American university, as far as I know, has said one word just to express something. Nothing, not a word. Right. So this dehumanization of Palestinians, it's on a continuum. It runs from this kind of petty dehumanization we have on our campuses here to the material dehumanization that we see taking place in Gaza and the West Bank. And so this is one way to hopefully begin the process of ending the dehumanization and rehumanizing the Palestinian. So congratulations.
Thank you. And where we begin the story is how we make sense of where we are today, and that's why history is so absolutely crucial. And it's something Karim and I and Sadi we've always discussed and known, because in Lebanon and the Arab world, it's just taken for granted. People know where the history began on Palestine. It's a non it's not controversial. It's so obvious. You don't even debate the history of the question of Palestine because it's so taken for granted and given. And so therefore you could talk about a million other things like what's the appropriate way to move forward, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But here, we've been confronted with a wall of denial, a dam of denial that finally is breaking, one hopes, but not fast enough to save the people of Palestine, unfortunately, at least not yet.
I just have two quick questions, Osama. First, maybe you can tell people who MakdisiStreet is, since it's the MakdisiStreet chair. And second, I think it's okay to mention that you are the first MakdisiStreet chair, right? You've been appointed personally.
Yeah, yes, I have been, but it's really not about me. It's really about, as you said, it's about the chair and about endowing sort of a program and a chair to sort of keep like, to bring to attention of students and faculty and community the idea of Palestinian and Arab history and humanity. And so May Ziadi, of course, was we know her since we were educated in Lebanon. May Ziadi was, of course, a famous, a pioneering poet and writer and feminist in the early part of the 20th century, who was born in Nazareth, grew up in Nazareth, and then moved to Lebanon and then to Egypt. And she had a famous salon in Egypt, a literary salon in Egypt. And she really was very, very famous as this sort of a pioneering, what we call Nahdawi Renaissance kind of writer and poet and feminist. And she was actually, at one point, she was imprisoned, not imprisoned, I mean, committed to an asylum. And then eventually taken out. And there's a whole story about that as well, which we can get into later. But the point is, her very trajectory going from Palestine to Lebanon to Egypt embodies and personifies this interconnectedness of this region before the colonial states and before Zionism and Israel sort of separated and destroyed not just Palestine, but the interconnectedness of this region. And so again, it's an indication and a hope and a belief that and an insistence that every people deserves history.
Yeah, I think we should wrap here. I want to, for what it's worth, I think this is a theme that we've been talking about a lot in this podcast, and I think it's at least for me, it's important to keep repeating, which is, it seems to me that the opposite of Zionism, sort of intellectually and politically, is this coexistence that we talk about all the time. This idea of being able to go from place to place to mix, that there's a plurality, there's a multiculturalism, this all this kind of stuff is the opposite of the Zionist project in its foundation as well, right?
Yes, exactly. To refer to Usama's previous book, there was an ecumenical frame that Zionism smashed and destroyed, and we live in the aftermath of that smashing. But this is a good place to end on, for once, on a note of good news in the midst of this otherwise calamitous period that we're living through. Thank you, guys. We'll talk again next week.
Thank you both. Good to see you.
Thanks.